So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, friends, now and are. It's my proud duty this afternoon to introduce Dr. Rowan Williams, who will deliver to us the Peace Lecture from Academy Heddiw, of which he is the chair. It is, I believe, only the second such lecture, and here in Llangollen will be the only live presentation this year. The Eisteddfod is signally honoured in the Academy's choice of our festival as the venue for both its Peace Lecture and also for its Young Peacemaker Awards. Academy Heddiw is a young organisation, at least compared with the Eisteddfod. Formally established in 2020, though over a decade in the making. Dr. Williams became its chair in 2021. It is the only such institution in the 4 nations of the United Kingdom and is an alliance involving every university in Wales, the Learned Society of Wales, the Welsh Centre for International Affairs, and the Coleg Cymraeg Cenedlaethol, with the support of the Peace Movement in Wales, Race Council Wales, Urdd Gobaith Cymru, and the Office of the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. It's pretty well connected. To this observer, intrigued observer, I have to say, it seems like an educational institute, a research institute, a network, a think tank, a lobbyist, and a publicist, all rolled into one. The list of achievements in the first 4 years is very impressive, and Academy Heddiw looks well set to become a force in shaping important policy decisions for the modern Wales, to help Wales become a better country. Our speaker today, Dr. Williams, will be best known to many of you for his decade of service as Archbishop of Canterbury, the 104th holder of that post. You may also be aware of his later long tenure as Master of Magdalen College, Cambridge, another role requiring high levels of political and diplomatic skill. What will undoubtedly have impressed you is his record of consistent endeavour as an academic and as an organisational leader to honestly and deeply address and make progress on difficult and troubling social and moral issues. For example, in the areas of equality and sexuality. He was also co-chair of the Independent Commission on the Constitutional Future of Wales, which reported just a few months ago. You will gather then that Dr. Williams is no stranger to the task of tackling some of the great challenges of our time. And I, for one, am looking forward immensely to hearing what he has to say to the Eisteddfod community on the subject of peace, which, as you all know, is close to our hearts. Dr. Williams.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Chris. A diolch am gwahoddiad I fod yma. It's a great privilege and a great pleasure to be part of this event. I'll be speaking partly in Welsh this afternoon, and since there's no simultaneous translation, I shall attempt to make sure that what I say in Welsh will also be available in English. So bear with me if I do a little bit of on-the-spot translating. Rydyn ni wedi bod yn dathlu blwyddyn diwethaf ac eleni canmlwyddiant eitha bwysig. Canmlwyddiant un o'r ddigwyddiadau mwyaf arddoecaol mewn hanes gwleidyddol Deyrnas Unedig yn yr 20fed ganrif. We've been celebrating in this last year one of the most important, but also one of the least known centenaries in the political history of the United Kingdom in the last century. In May 1923, the Welsh League of Nations Union assembled in Aberystwyth. Cadeirydd yr undeb flwyddyn hyn oedd Annie Hughes Griffiths, sy'n dod yn reiddiol o Langeitho yng Ngheredigion. Graig weinidog Capel Presbyteroedd Gymraeg yn Charing Cross, Llundain. Benyw sy'n eisoes wedi ennill enw da trwy ei gwaith dros Brifysgol Cymru a'r Llyfrgell Genedlaethol. A'i gŵr cyntaf oedd Thomas Ellis, gwleidyddwr enwog ym Mhlaid Rhyddfrydol Gymraeg, sydd wedi marw yn 1899. Annie Hughes Griffiths was the chair of this meeting in Aberystwyth, a woman who already had a very considerable reputation in Wales because of her work with the university, the National Library, and her first husband had been a very prominent Welsh Liberal politician. Her second husband was the minister of the Welsh Presbyterian Chapel in Charing Cross in London. Yn ystod y gynulleidfa yn Aberystwyth, derbyniwyd cynnig gan Rose Davies o Aberdâr yn awgrymu anfon apel o ran Merched Cymru i Ferched yr Unol Daleithiau. Apel sy'n galw ar Lywodraeth yr Unol Daleithiau i ymuno ar cynghrair cenhedloedd, a hefyd i weithio ynghyd tua rhyw fath o lys rhyngwladol, gweithio tua gyfyngiadau effeithiol ar ddiwydiant arfau a masnach drygiau, a chreu ymddiffiniadau newydd yn erbyn beth rydyn ni nawr yn galw people trafficking. This meeting in Aberystwyth accepted and voted in favour of a motion from Rose Davies from Aberdare, which proposed an appeal from the women of Wales to the women of the United States of America, an appeal calling on the Congress of the United States to join the League of Nations Union and also to work together towards some kind of international court, to work together for effective restraints on the arms trade and the drugs trade, and also to create new protections against what we now call people trafficking, a proposal well in advance of its time in all kinds of ways. The Assembly in Aberystwyth voted in favour of Rose Davies's motion, and so the process began of making this vision a reality. A committee was created with members coming from every region of Wales, and a campaign was initiated to raise funds to support this work and to guarantee some kind of remuneration, especially for the women who were leading this movement. Door-to-door collections were organised, and there was a great deal of publicity in the press. Some of those who cooperated in this work, Mary Ellen Pritchard from Pwllheli is a good example, saw this as a real spiritual vocation, not just a task to be fulfilled. And one of the results of attitudes like this was that rather less money turned out to be necessary. There's nothing like committed vision for saving expenditure at times. And that meant that although the fundraising campaign was rather less successful than people hoped, the work went on without any problem at all. Parhaodd y gwaith heb unrhyw problem gyda'r gefnogaeth mwy na 400 ysgrifennyddwyr lleol. More than 400 local secretaries supported this work. Roedd ymgyrch am gronfa ac am lofnodion hefyd yn ymgyrch addysgol boblogaidd. Roedd y trefnyddion yn gwneud ei apel yng nghyd-destun cyfarfodau sy'n cynnwys esboniad ofalus a thrafodaeth drwyadl o'r rasianal a phwrpas y ddogfen. A roedd hwn siwr o fod yn elfen bwysig proses addysgol, proses o greu gweledigaeth gyfunol yn wyneb sialens gyfunol. Rhywbeth rydyn ni eisiau dysgu yn cyd-destun cyd-ymdeithasol a diwylliannol heddiw. There was a great emphasis in the campaign for funds and for signatures, great emphasis on doing this work in the context of an educational process. So there was opportunity in fundraising meetings to explain the rationale and the purpose of the appeal. And that played a very significant part in making this a matter of creating a shared vision in the face of a shared challenge. And that's something which we could do with learning something from in our own cultural and political context now, I suggest. Ac un o'r pethau mwyaf nodedig yn y proses oedd bod yr ymgyrch yn dod ynghyd â phobl o gefndir a chyffes mor amrywiol. Cymerwyd rhan bwysig yn ddigon naturiol o gofio cefndir Annie Hughes Griffiths ei hun, gan bobl oddi wrth gymunedau yn draddodiadol, anghydffurfiol a rhyddfrydol. Ond peth rhyfedd yw cefnogaeth sy'n dod o chwarterion anisgwyliadwy. O'r Blaid Lafur, oedd Rose Davies Aberdâr yn fywiog iawn mewn Plaid Lafur yn Ne Cymru, enw cynefin ei lawer o bobl fel ynad a fel gadeirydd fenywaidd gyntaf Pwyllgor Addysg Cyngor Sir, a chefnogaeth hyd yn oed o'r Blaid Gedwadol. Roedd llawer o offeiriadau yr Eglwys yng Nghymru yn cyfrannogi yn y prosiect, gweithaf hanes chwerw diweddar o ymdrech am ddatgysylliad ar Eglwys Anglicanaidd. Oedd Graig Archesgob Cymru, Margaret Edwards, yn lansio'r cynnyrch yn Llanelwy. One of the most remarkable things about this project was that it drew people from every social and confessional background in Wales. It was a time of political and religious tension, but people from the Labour Party and even the Conservative Party backed this project. Rose Davies, who proposed the motion in Aberystwyth, was well known as a local magistrate and the first female chair of a county educational committee in Wales. Nonconformists and Anglicans, despite the bitter controversy over disestablishment, joined in. Clergy of the Church in Wales were prominent in the process, and the appeal was launched in St Asaph by the wife of the Archbishop of Wales, Margaret Edwards. Among those who supported the appeal, there were many who'd been pacifists during the course of the Great War, but also many who'd supported the war effort. There were, of course, very many people who had lost family members in the Great War, and that had changed attitudes towards conflict a great deal. And although the majority of those involved, among the organisers and the signatories, seemed to have been bilingual, there were many English speakers from the border counties especially who supported this movement. The supporters came from every social and economic group. Catherine Stevens, who's written a really excellent and authoritative article on this history, has said that the appeal was a kind of symbol of a cooperative spirit ready to overcome the social divisions of the period. So by January 1924, something like 390,000 signatures had been collected throughout Wales. The history that follows, the history of taking the document itself to the United States, Annie Griffiths and a group of her collaborators went in January and February 1924. The history of how this appeal was received enthusiastically in America from east to west. The history of all those meetings which took place between supporters of the appeal and some of the leaders of American society, including even President Calvin Coolidge. This is a really extraordinary history which would deserve an entire lecture to itself. And once again, I want to note a brilliant article on this question, on the reception of the appeal in America by Meg Ellis and Rhiannon Williams in the book that was produced last year on this history. Ond pwynt pwysicaf felly yw'r dylanwad ar apel yn America. Nid yw'n syndod mawr nad oedd Congres yr Unol Daleithiau yn cytuno ar apel yr unwaith. Nid modd arferol cyrff llywodraethol yw hwn. Ond fel mae Ellis Barker wedi dangos, oedd yr apel yn elfen arwyddocâl yng nghyd-destun mudiadau amrywiol yn yr Unol Daleithiau. Cyfnod anodd iawn oedd y 20au yn America, gyda drwgdybiadau ynglŷn â chymunyddiaeth, argyfwng economaidd digyffelyb, a llawer iawn o bwys a thundra cymdeithasol. Mewn cyfnod fel hyn, nid oes llawer o le yn blaediaeth anheddwch, ond effaith hyn oll oedd bod angen mawr cefnogaeth a chydymddibyniaeth ar y rhai sy'n dal i weithio mwyn byd di-ryfel, i fenthyg y geiriau ar apel. It wasn't an easy time in the United States of America. It's no surprise that the Congress of the United States didn't vote overnight in favor of this appeal. But what happened was that in a period when international support for peace movements in the States was more than ever necessary, the presence of this appeal in the United States of America did have a galvanizing and even a transforming effect on work towards a world without war, in the very pregnant words of the appeal itself. Mae tystiolaeth gennym am bwysigrwydd golygfa rhyngwladol i'r rhai sy'n gweithio yn America yn ystod y gyfnod hwn. Gweithaf y pwysau sy'n dod o'r rhai chwarterion ceidwadol ac isolationist yn America, fe barhaodd yn ymgyrch dros heddwch a chyfraith rhyngwladol effeithiol dros ddegawdau. Yn y flynyddoedd hyn, roedd y National Committee for the Cause and Cure of War yng nghyswllt agos a rheolaidd ar mudiad yng Nghymru. Ac roedd y National Committee hwn yn un o'r grwpiau mwyaf ddylanwadol gan lobio dros gytuneb celog briond yn 1928. Gytundeb sy'n cefnogi deddfwriaeth rhyngwladol I waharth ryfel. We've plenty of evidence that in the period following the presentation of the appeal in the United States, the National Committee for the Cause and Cure of War, one of the major American peace lobbies, was much encouraged by the events of 1923-24 and kept in regular touch with the movement in Wales. It was this National Committee for the Cause and Cure of War, once again galvanized and led by women in the United States, that played a key role in lobbying for the Kellogg-Briand Agreement in 1928, a treaty which supported the international limitations on military development, rearmament, and so forth. In other words, the appeal was more than just an idealistic or utopian venture. Many of those who supported the appeal in the 20s, both in Wales and in America, were active supporters in the efforts in the 40s towards the establishment of the United Nations as we know it, and departments of the United Nations like UNESCO. According to Iris Barker in her account of this afterlife of the appeal, it provided a focus of great importance for disarmament movements and membership of an international court during that period. And in America, that surge in support was no small thing, if we bear in mind, says Alice Barker, the general opposition which prevailed in America towards any kind of international agreement or international cooperation. And I think it's fair to say that that's not just a historic problem for the United States, but let's not go there just now. So, coming up to date, in 2014, the text of this appeal, lodged in the Temple of Peace and Health in Cardiff, was rediscovered, complete with its original, rather beautiful and elaborate leather binding. And in the years since 2014, we've seen a whole range of new campaigns and new initiatives developing around this. The campaign to have the document and the signatures, and of course the chest in which they were housed, a very handsome purpose-made oak chest, to have all this brought back to Wales. The project to prepare a digital version of the whole text and of the signatures. The project of identifying the signatories of the appeal and giving a more complete account of the history and background of the women who led the movement in 1923-24. A group with the wonderful name of Heddwch Nain or Heddwch Mam Gi, Grandma's Peace Project, as it were, was founded to pursue research on the history and the legacy of the appeal. The Cymdeithas y Cymod, the Fellowship of Reconciliation, gave some financial support to further research, especially the research of Laureat Ivor, and that's created a much more adequate profile of the original project. I've already mentioned more than once the book, A Rappel, The Appeal, which contains some of the wonderfully illuminating and quite surprising essays on the detail of this history. And there's plenty of room for new, fresh, and fruitful aspects of research around the events of that era. And this book also celebrates the success of the campaign to bring the document back to Wales. Mae'r llyfr hwn yn dathlu llwyddiant yr ymgyrch dros ddychweliad y ddogfen i Gymru. The document, complete with its oaken chest, returned in 1923 with the signatures, several miles worth of paper. Those nearly 400,000 signatures. Plenty of work still for researchers, plenty of new work to be done on the background, on the convictions of the signatories, the relations between this movement and other projects across the world, and the roots of the appeal, and some of the discussions in the 19th century and some of the peace movements of that era, notably the legacy of the great Henry Richards, and also the relation of some of these characters and some of the language of the appeal to work and advocacy that had gone on during the period of the First World War. So everything that's been done so far in these recent years about the appeal has made possible a more adequate understanding of the history of peace movements of the last century, not just in Wales, but worldwide. A hyd yn oed mwy na hyn, mae hanes yr apel yn bwrw golau ar cwestiynau pwysig iawn am natur diwylliad democrataidd. Cwestiynau tyma bach yn dair i ni heddiw. Yng ngweddill y darlith hon, byddwn yn grymu nifer o bynciau lle rydyn ni gallu dysgu rhywbeth o enghraifft Annie Griffiths, Rose Davies, Mary Ellis, a'r holl cwmwl tystion y mudiad yr ni wedi bod yn amlinellu tan y pwynt hwn. The history of the appeal throws light not just on questions of war and peace in the past, but on a whole set of issues around the nature of democratic culture, questions that are really quite urgent for us today. And so in what I have left to say, I'll be suggesting a number of areas where I think we can learn something important from Annie Griffiths and Rose Davies, Mary Ellis, and the whole cloud of witnesses of this movement that we've been thinking about so far. What lessons then should we be learning? Emerging from what we've just been considering about the impact of the appel in the United States, there's a very important point about the significance of the international voice of civil society. It's easy to score cheap points. I can think of at least one English journalist who did just this in a dismissive commentary on the centenary. I won't name him. Easy to score cheap points by noting that the United States Congress didn't, in fact, vote to join the League of Nations in response to the petition. But that implies a very simplistic view of how democracies work. Large-scale petitions seldom, if ever, force major shifts in international policy overnight. But what they do is gradually to widen what is regarded as normal in political argument in a society. We've seen how the American women's peace movement was galvanized by the events of 1924 to step up its campaigning. We've seen how the Kellogg-Briand Treaty of 1928 fits into that story. Some politicians, I think here of Gordon Brown as a good example, have spoken of the need for civil society activists to give permission to political leaders to push the envelope a little, and not to be constrained by nothing more than timid electoral calculations. Democratic government is neither a non-stop referendum on what happens to be popular at a single moment, nor a simple playing back to the electorate of what politicians imagine to be their preferences. There is something called political leadership, which, although it's a little bit elusive these days, no comment at all on the forthcoming events of this week, of course, it's a matter of changing a discourse, changing a climate, helping people see what is possible beyond what they thought. It involves a complex to and fro between government and people, government trying to take the temperature of a community, working out the direction of travel in the feelings and convictions of a population over a period. I think back to the Jubilee 2000 campaign about international debt and more recent campaigns about tax justice as examples of how a broad swathe of civil society activism helped to change the assumptions of large numbers of voters and so encouraged governments towards legislative changes that were modest but not negligible. Reinforced by international support, actions taken in solidarity in diverse contexts, this will be even more effective. Tax justice campaigning has shown this. But there's a range of developments, for example, to do with health-related legislation, the smoking ban, the labelling of foods to identify assorted health risks, and similar issues that show how, in a relatively short time, the default setting of politics can be shifted by concentrated, intelligent civil society campaigning. Things become thinkable. And above all, in our present context, the various campaigns that in one way or another sustain pressure on the use of or investment in fossil fuels have demonstrated that informed activism from civil society can indeed change the popular assessment of what's thinkable. I want to move on to a second point, though. Civil society activism doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's not enough to create single, focused, issue-based campaigns by appealing to the public at large. There needs to be an ongoing structure of mutual engagement and commitment, what we could call a thick texture of social interaction that helps people win each other's trust and so enables robust and demanding argument. The research so far carried out on the process of gathering signatures in that short and intensive period over the winter of 1923 and 24 makes it very clear that the densely woven texture of Welsh community life at this time, in both rural and urban settings, was of crucial importance in at least two ways. There was a pool of experienced volunteers whose energies could be harnessed for secretarial support, organising meetings, and door-to-door canvassing for signatures. But also, this canvassing worked because of a general expectation of people being challenged to join in ambitious projects of social collaboration. We've noted in passing how significant the religious communities of Wales were in the campaign, and how, very remarkably, Anglicans and nonconformists were able to suspend hostilities. But there's also the role of local temperance societies, which has been highlighted in the research, as well as the networks, especially of newly qualified female school teachers in Wales, who were beginning to mobilise for better conditions and more security through the newly formed National Union of Teachers. Given the focus of the petition, it's not surprising that involvement with the movement for women's voting rights is a recurrent detail in the background of many campaigners. And finally, there were all those who'd been active in local campaigns for war memorials of different kinds, not least those who'd been bereaved by the conflict. And it's pretty clear that the appel was seen by some as something like an alternative or supplementary memorial, another way of doing justice to those they had lost. So in the broadest sense, community organisation had proved essential for a project like the 1924 appeal. And this takes me to a further point. If democracy is going to function effectively and critically, it needs an educated public. But the education that matters is not simply what is communicated in a statutory school system. It requires practical involvement in cooperation and decision-making at local levels, the kind of experience that was provided by the voluntary networks that facilitated the campaign of 1923-1924. A political system in which the citizen is seen as passive, except when actually voting, is set up for disaster, for cynicism, for populist reaction, for a growing tendency to regard a political career as unthinkable for people with principle and critical intelligence. Once again, far be it from me to comment on anything happening tomorrow. If these things sound uncomfortably familiar at the moment, we should be looking not only at the dysfunctionality of our electoral system, or of Westminster as it has become, we should be looking at the impoverishment of local democratic culture, the world of volunteering and community organisation, where people educate one another in democratic creativity. The organisers and signatories of the petition came from a society that, with all its undeniable inequalities and repressions, still fostered a significant number of institutions in which this kind of education was normal. Wales, with its powerful Christian and cooperative traditions, not least its strong 19th century commitment to wider access to school and university education, was very well placed to develop an initiative like the Appel. Now, it's easy to romanticize the period and to exaggerate the extent of deliberate community and political engagement. Welsh moral exceptionalism is familiar enough in our cultural history, and it's not always a healthy factor. But the figures speak for themselves. In 1923, the total population of Wales was around 2.5 million. If a little less than 500,000 women signed the Appel, that accounts for an impressive proportion of the whole nation. And as we've noted, the social composition of the signatories was undoubtedly very diverse. The article I mentioned by Catherine Stevens details one woman, Catherine Pugh, described in the 1891 census as a stocking knitter, a secure but very low status job, who was not only a local organizer for the petition, but already had a record as a very vocal public advocate for women's suffrage. The continuing research that Academi Heddwch Cymru is sponsoring and supporting on the backgrounds and convictions of the signatories will reveal more about the democratic profile of the women who supported the petition. But we already have enough evidence to challenge any conclusion that they came from a narrow band of the prosperous or even the pious. But the final point that has to be made is that for all this variety, the petition reflects what can only be called a level of ethical literacy in Welsh society. Ethical literacy. That's not to appeal to a lost golden age of Welsh moral purity. From Caradog Evans to Byron Rogers, we've had plenty of satirical deconstructions of that kind of nostalgia. But what's at issue is something more nuanced, something to do with those moments in history where a critical mass of the population is able to identify aspects of a system, national or international, as destructively inhuman and morally unsustainable. It's the moment of Solidarność in Poland in the 80s, or the Velvet Revolution in Prague. Further back, the end of Salazar's regime in Portugal. The moment at which Nelson Mandela could briefly capture the idea of an alternative to an uncompromisingly bloody revolution in South Africa and make that persuasive for black and white alike. All of these examples have been followed by a return to routine politics, to compromise and failure and even corruption. But the important thing is that at certain points, some person or group is able to do two things: to identify a radical alternative vision of society and to persuade ordinary citizens that it's not impossible and that their individual collaboration can be part of a cumulative change of the political weather. The Appel of 1924 was not the only initiative in the UK of the 1920s that sought to build on the sense of tragic moral failure before and during the Great War. The whole of the League of Nations movement, which had nurtured the Appel itself, reflects this mentality, and later developments, like the Peace Pledge Union in the 30s, built on the same foundations. But this particular venture, with its concentration on women's political agency, with its deep roots in what I've called the Christian and cooperative vision, with its sustained efforts to reach and involve people across divides that were taken for granted, is certainly distinctive enough to deserve celebration. I've been suggesting here that aspects of this campaign can at the very least help us focus on some questions about what it takes to sustain a genuinely intelligent and participatory democracy. I won't apologise for casting a sideways glance to the work of the Commission on the Constitutional Future of Wales, which reported in January of this year, and which underlined precisely some of these points about the need to build not just constitutional structures, but a culture of inclusive democratic optimism. There's not much at the moment in our public life in Wales or in the UK as a whole to encourage us to think that our political systems are all that heavily invested in developing this. But the legacy of Annie Hughes Griffiths and her co-workers suggests that we should never underestimate the possibility of a renaissance in what I've called ethical literacy. But for that to happen, we also need to work with passionate commitment to strengthen and make the best use of what is left to us of the institutions that nourish this perspective. In faith communities, in educational institutions, in local organising and campaigning. Mae'r dyfodol yn llawn gobaith, said the petition. The future is big with hope. That is such a counterintuitive statement for most of us these days. But we need to look hard at the choices we can still make, the connections we can still create and celebrate. And where better to do that than in the context of this Llangollen Eisteddfod? We don't have to be passive political consumers who occasionally take part in an opinion poll called an election. We can shape the imagination of our society. That is what the petition of 1924 did, and it's a legacy supremely worth preserving. Diolch yn fawr iawn.